And thanks very much for all the comrades who've signed up. Just a few points on the materials on the website. I've produced a talk outline. I'm not going to glorify this with the title lecture. I've produced an outline of some of the key points and some key questions, which I will try to do, which I will do for every talk. And I've also included, or I've also placed online a series of documents which I will refer to, and they illustrate some general points, but they're really for sort of follow-up work, or indeed in preparation for the talk. The other thing is I've done a suggested reading list, fairly brief reading list, and I'm very well aware that some of those books are maybe not as easy to get hold of. Because of the lockdown, I'm not able to get to a library, so I had to rely upon books I had to hand. So, and I'm sure you're all in the same position. Okay, this evening's session then is on the origins and the formation of the Labour Party, and I've put the question mark, the voice of the organised working class. I thought that it was important to look at the history of the Labour Party because of recent discussions, particularly about the Corbyn project, about the general election defeat, and I suppose the wider questions both within inside the Labour Left Alliance and the broader left in the Labour Party of whether we should remain members of the Labour Party if we were socialists. Could the Labour Party be an instrument for the achievement of socialism? And what struck me about that was that this question had been asked historically. Indeed, it seemed to be a recurrent question. And for those of us who've been, I first joined the Labour Party in 1970. For those of us who've been involved in the Labour Party and on the left in general, it was it seemed to be a key question. So I thought that by looking at the history of the party, we might find some answers, but we might also look at previous debates. It's very clear that there's quite an extensive body of historical work on the history of the Labour Party. If you go onto the Labour Party's own site, however, you won't find very much of it, but you will find a number of socialist writers who have made contributions to try and understand the nature of the Labour Party. Much of the work written by very pro-Labour historians and pro-Labour leadership historians have tended, I think, to exceptionalize the British Labour Party, and it is clearly very different from most socialist movements in other European countries. My own particular comparison is with the SPD in Germany. Its development and origins is really very different indeed. And there was certainly a dominant idea, particularly by the reformists in the Labour Party and the right wing in the Labour Party, that Labour was very much part of an exceptional story of British history. And in particular, if you looked at the older books that were published on the history of the Labour Party, they would do a lineage going back through British radical and liberal thought. I, as a teenager, had a book on history of the Labour Party, which began with the Peasants' Revolt, but located this very much in a sort of forward march of Labour, the idea that the development of the Labour Party grew out of the growth of British democracy. So it was very much placing Labour within the framework of British society. And I think that's quite important because in many ways, that is the way that we should see it and look at the nature of British society, British imperialism and British capitalism, which in a way created or helped to create a working class movement that reflects the particular history of British capitalism. So the approaches that you find in the main histories are the idea of a specific Labour history. This is fairly teleological. It just sees a series of advances, usually culminating in the period that the writer has arrived at, and therefore sees the completion of Labour's project variously in 1945, or if you're a member of the left, somewhere in the 1980s, or if you're a Blairite, somewhere in 1997. And that sort of Labour history approach has in fact been quite dominant. But a very influential book, which I referred to in the first of my readings by Ralph Miliband, Parliamentary Socialism, which first appeared in 1961, I think was one of the first books to seriously look at the nature of Labour, and particularly as a parliamentary party, and very much link it to whether it was possible for socialists to use it as an instrument for socialist change. And Miliband continued to write after the 1960s, and his last work appeared in the early 1940s, sorry, 1990s, 1994. And in that, he does throw up or revisit many of those questions, and I won't spoil what's going to come, and when we'll perhaps look at some of his conclusions. The other approach, which is one I, as a student and indeed as a researcher, spent a lot of time looking at, was the idea of history from below. And I've carried out a number of studies into the history of the Labour Party in particular areas, particularly in the period I'm going to talk about. And this tended to particularize and indeed break up the Labour movement from being part of a national, indeed an international movement. It tended to see it as a series of local developments. This would be particularly true of looking at the Independent Labour Party in Northern England, or the Social Democratic Federation in London, or various local studies, all useful in and of themselves, but in a sense fragmenting what I think is part of a bigger picture. So those are some of the themes, but there are a couple of others which I think have also worked into our study. And this is something that E.P. Thompson refers to in his Making of the English Working Class, and that's the enormous condescension of posterity. In particular, trying to look at the past as something of a morality tale, and this isn't just something that the right do, of trying to find heroes and pioneers who are just like us. It's also something that the left does, and in particular, the focus on the idea of a series of leaders who are going to betray us. In other words, if only we'd had proper left-wing leaders, then the history of the Labour Party would have been very different. And this again throws up the question of leadership, but perhaps more importantly, our definitions and understandings of what socialism is, and whether socialism will arrive through Parliament, whether it's an extra parliamentary movement, but more importantly, our relationship to those leaders, and in particular, the idea of whether the Labour Party can be reclaimed. This sort of heroes and villains approach, and we all know to boo the baddies like McDonald, but we know to cheer the goodies like Anaya and Bevan or Keir Hardie. This approach, I think, does tend to caricature, and again tends to remove Labour from wider political and social developments. But it also throws up questions about our relationship with leaders, and whether getting good leaders or getting good MPs is really the key to success, and where that stands. So those are some of the themes I'm going to look at over the course of the talks, but you can obviously see that they'll have some relevance this evening. To begin with, I want to just sketch out the political, the social and the economic context of Britain in the period 1880 to 1914, which is the formative period for the Labour Party, I think. Britain is one of the world's dominant imperialist powers. About a quarter of the land surface of the world is controlled by the British Empire. Britain was, by the 1850s, the dominant world economic power. It still remains, in the period we're talking about, one of the three key economic powers, but its relative position is declining. So we have an imperialist power, and the impact of imperialism on both the living standards and the economy of Britain, particularly on a section of workers, the so-called Labour aristocracy, I think is significant. It gives Britain a very different form than other European countries, so that its working class is different, its traditions and so on are different. This is also a period of inter-imperialist rivalry in which British imperialism feels itself under threat. It starts, for example, to look at the possibilities of alliances, and particularly the rivalry that's coming from in Europe from Germany, but also the United States as well. So politics in this way are in one sense quite stable. Britain is a very rich country. It's able, for example, to give many concessions to its working class on the basis of the empire, but individual capitalists and sections of capitalism find themselves increasingly having to attack the position of the working class, intensification of labour, destruction of long-held privileged positions, and so on. Now, politically, the importance of this imperialist strength is that the socialist and the labour movement from the period from the 1850s until the 1880s is in a period of relative quiescence. I say relative because obviously there are radical reform movements, there are strikes and so on. But it isn't really until the 1880s that we can see the revival of both socialist and more militant forms of trade unionism. The type of politics that we see is dominated by two bourgeois parties. Remember that for much of the period we're talking about in the 1880s to 1914, a sizable percentage of the male working class population can vote, around about 60%. There's a form of property qualification, but it means for those workers who are in relatively stable employment and relatively stable living conditions actually do have the right to vote. And the two main capitalist parties, the Liberal Party and the Conservatives, do have to make some response to working class demands. The Conservatives have, in the late 19th century, developed a form of popular imperialism and jingoism. As the song said, musical song said, we don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do, we've got the men, we've got the guns, and we've got the money too. And that type of popular imperialism and a degree of social reform is one strategy that the Conservatives adopt, and they're relatively successful in this. The Liberals, as the major industrial capitalist party, they too address working class concerns, and in particular, they have attempted to appeal, particularly to the organised trade unions, a policy which we often refer to as liblabism, which is to encourage the representation of working class interests. There are already working class MPs, usually sponsored by the miners' unions, who are elected under the Liberal banner from the 1870s. However, that relatively stable politics starts to come under threat in the 1880s. And one threat to this is both the growth of unions amongst previously unorganized sections of workers, such as the match workers at Bryant and Mays, the dockers in London, and various areas in the building and construction trades. And in response to these strikes are often in response to attempts to cut wages or attempts to worsen conditions. And these attacks throughout the 1890s start to extend to more skilled and indeed stronger groups of workers. In 1897, for example, there's an engineering lockout on the basis of cutting wages. And the engineers are a skilled and well-organized group of workers. So they've already developed quite well-organized and coherent unions. But even there, these attacks, are made and are successful. Alongside these forms of attack are also legal attacks, for example, on contracts, and particularly on trade union rights, particularly the right to picket, and in a series of judgments on damages, which we would summarize in the Taff Vale case of 1901, unions can be sued for the damages caused to an employer during a strike, which means that a strike is, effectively ruled out. So law, the counterattack by employers, places for many trade unions who've had a fairly cozy relationship with the Liberals up until this point, places the idea of how they should respond. How should they get legislation that might, for example, secure their rights? The fact that the Conservatives have been in power for much of this period, and the Liberals, and it looks like the Liberals are not going to come into power, lends many trade union leaders to the idea of independent labour representation. And the model that they adopt is not initially a separate political party, as we would understand it, but a form of labour representation, very much modelled on what Irish nationalists had done from the 1870s, which is a block of MPs in the House of Commons who can then extract concessions from either Conservatives or the Liberal Party. In other words, that they use their voting strength as a bargaining counter. And that very much fits in with the politics of the Labour aristocracy that sees themselves as an integral part of capitalism. They have a labour interest within capitalism. Their aim isn't to overthrow capitalism. They have their rightful place within it, and they're trying to secure that. So in a sense, it's a recognition of the position of the Labour aristocracy. These are people who may well be, prepared for some sort of social change, but they're very craft conscious. They're very well aware of their position in British society. So in that way, I think we can see some changes emerging from the politics of the Labour aristocracy. But there's another type of politics that are emerging as well, and that is an explicitly socialist politics. And indeed, many of the disputes and many of the new unions were often organised by socialists. Eleanor Marx, Marx's daughter, was quite influential in organising women workers. People like Tom Mann and John Burns were all explicitly socialist. So this form of socialist politics was both a sort of form of agency, initiating struggles, but also the growth of those sorts of politics reflected those struggles. Now, the three main groups that I would just like to mention, they are covered in the readings. The Social Democratic Federation, which was the only group claiming to be Marxist. Theodore Rothstein, in the second reading, talks about their historical development. He's writing in 1908. The next grouping are the Fabians, and there's a diary entry there from Beatrice Webb talking about her political role. And then lastly, three readings, one by Blatchford from his book Merry England, some statements by Keir Hardie, and then the programme of the party, the Independent Labour Party. Now those parties are all really quite different from each other, and they're going to be represented in the Labour Representation Committee. Indeed, they'll have quite a long history. The Fabians still exist in one form, and indeed the ILP exists in a particular form. In the 1980s, I interviewed people whose parents had been founder members, and so it still has some sort of organizational form. The Social Democratic Federation, like the Fabians, began life in the 1880s, and it did explicitly call itself Marxist. Its Marxism is often sort of jokingly referred to as Anglo-Marxism, and it was a fairly sectarian reading of Marxism. Engels was fairly critical of its leading light. Henry Mayer's Heinemann, a former Tory stockbroker, who had quite an interesting way of addressing meetings. He appeared in his upper middle class garb, top hat and frock coat, and then thanked the workers for being so benevolent in supporting him. I'm fairly certain that Tressel's ragged trouser philanthropists, in a sense, takes that trope. Tressel was a member of the SDF, as indeed were quite a large number of people who later are going to be significant in socialist politics. Although the SDF is a fairly small group, it affiliates to the Labour Party with to the LRC with 9,000 members, probably was much smaller. But probably in its history in this period, as many as 50 to 60,000 people passed through its ranks and did give it an education, did give them some form of socialist political education. So its influence is actually quite considerable. And most of the figures that, most of the leading figures in British Labourism and socialism will have had some contact with the SDF. We can perhaps come back at a later point to talk about the nature of its Marxism, in particular Heinemann's concessions to imperialism and indeed racism in many ways. The Fabians are a group who are often given a tremendous credit, particularly by the right wing of the Labour Party, for the foundation of the Labour Party. And indeed, they've often been historically regarded as something of a think tank, you know, intellectuals, upper middle class intellectuals who provide some sort of theoretical justifications for Labour's position. In the period that we're talking about, they had a policy of permeation. They had a theory which in a sense is a very vulgarized form of Marxism. It's so vulgarized as probably not to be recognizable, pardon me, in that way. And this was that capitalism was, in a sense, evolving naturally towards a form of collectivism. And their job as intellectuals and as you know, part of an educated middle class was, in a sense, to guide it in that direction. So they produced papers and books and collected information. But they also attempted to permeate and influence existing parties, both the Conservatives and the Liberal Party. So the idea of independent Labour representation or independent working class politics didn't apply to them. If anything, they were quite disdainful towards the working class. And indeed, they had very little to do with many of the more militant struggles. So their reputation as being this sort of dynamic think tank does apply at a very abstract level. People like George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells and so on were very influential members in it and of course exert quite a big intellectual influence. But the Fabians themselves tended to be disdainful to what they called unthinking persons, and their aim was to try to turn thinking persons into socialists and therefore, you know, move towards some sort of elite politics. The last group, and I think in many ways the most important, the one that I've said on my notes there, socialism with an ethical face, was established in the 1890s. It grew again out of a trade union struggle, or it was important in terms of a trade union struggle in Bradford at Manningham Mills in 1890 to 1891, again involving a large number of women workers and around issues of wage cuts. And this was a much more eclectic movement. It included people who were quite clearly Marxist, some of whom had been in the SDF, or indeed still were in the SDF, but it also included trade union militants. It included, I suppose, what might be referred to as ethical socialists, emotional socialists, moral socialists. And its heartlands initially were very much in northern England, particularly the West Riding of Yorkshire and in Lancashire. In its first, I think, 5 years, about a third of its membership was concentrated in the West Riding of Yorkshire. Now, this group stressed the idea of independent Labour representation. And although it did have a socialist program, it committed itself to collective ownership, it explicitly rejected the idea of being called the Socialist Labour Party. It rejected that idea on the grounds that socialism would, in a sense, frighten those who might well be moving towards the idea of working class politics. Also, their idea was for a fairly broad grouping that would include really all sections of the working class movement. It was a very federal organization. And indeed, although it was very clearly on the left, it also had, I think it reflected very much the ethical dimension, very much influenced in many ways in its style and so on by religious nonconformity. So in that sense, it does lead to the old view that the Labour Party had more to do with Methodism and Marxism. But again, many of its more militant and more coherent socialists were organized in that grouping and indeed would remain in that current into the 1930s. So those are the existing socialist groupings, and they, I think, are going to be very influential, very important in their in the early development of the Labour Party. Now, I've already explained that there'd been something of an employer's offensive against the trade unions. I've talked about the legal restrictions, and in 1899, the TUC passed a resolution calling for the development of of labour representation, and this idea of labour representation partly reflected a long history of lib-lab of working class MPs standing under the Liberal banner, particularly miners, and getting elected. But the other element that he worked on had been relative successes from the 1890s, from the 1895 and 1892 elections of individual socialists standing as socialist or Labour representatives. And there was also a tradition in local government as well. Indeed, the SDF and the ILP were strong enough to take control of West Ham Council in 1898. So there was already, in a sense, two sort of templates here for how politics could be conducted. The conference explicitly wanted to bring together trade unionists and representatives of socialist groups. And I think the reason why, as we can see in some of the later conferences, is that socialists, particularly in the ILP and the SDF, it was clear that they had organizational and ideological heft, that they would provide, in a sense, the leaven, and that also they could, for many trade unionists, they would represent something of a break from lib-labism. But the Labour Representation Committee, as you will see if you look at the report in The Guardian, the Manchester Guardian, I've given the link to that, but also if you look at the specific aims, you can see that it still focuses on representation. So its aims are to establish a distinct Labour group in Parliament who shall have their own whips and agree their own policy. But it also says that they will embrace a readiness to cooperate with any party which for the time being may be engaged in promoting legislation in the direct interests of Labour. So you can see that there are sort of two tensions there. It says a Labour group, it doesn't say socialist, and it does hint that it will cooperate very much in the line of the Irish nationalists that I referred to earlier. Now, the Labour Representation Committee was formed, and it had a federal structure comprising of trade union representatives. There were 7 of them at the beginning, 2 members of the SDF, 2 members of the ILP, and 1 Fabian. The Fabians were actually fairly reluctant to get involved, and the delegate from the Fabians, Edward Pease, actually had to pay his own affiliation fees. So you can see they were less keen there. Now, what gave the LRC its impact was a set of electoral agreements with the Liberal Party. These were initially secret, but it became fairly obvious that, in a sense, the Liberals were going to stand aside and allow LRC-backed candidates to take seats. So there were a series of by-elections leading up to 1906, and in those, the Liberals stood aside. There were victories for LRC candidates, although not in every case. So Lib-Labism and the idea of cooperating with the Liberals was by no means dead. And in fact, if anything, in those years and even long after, the debate about the relationship with the Liberal Party was very significant. On the notes, I give some figures about the growth of the LRC, and I suppose the turning point that's often identified is the 1906 general election, in which 29 LRC MPs are elected, 18 of whom define themselves as socialist. We know quite a lot about them because somebody in almost a fairly modern way submitted a questionnaire and asked them about their favorite books, what had influenced them. It didn't ask about who their favorite character was or what their favorite color was, or what they thought of Big Brother or anything like that. But it was a fairly interesting look at their politics in that period. But the electoral rise of the LRC, which is now styled the Labour Party, was steady. In the by 1910, it had gained 42 MPs, and it had a vote of. There were 2 elections in that year, and votes of around about 300,000 and 400,000. The growth of both the numbers of MPs and the growth of votes was probably attributed more to the Miners' Federation of Great Britain joining the LRC in 1908. And also the growth is very clearly linked to the withdrawal of Liberal candidates. So much of the vote that we're seeing is still a Lib-Lab vote. So was the LRC, the Labour Party, a political success? How might we gauge that? Well, throughout the period, there were continuing debates at conferences about its relationship with the Liberals, and those can be easily distinguished as Lib-Lab trade unionists versus socialists. And there is an element of truth in that. Some conferences of the LRC do vote explicitly for socialist positions, but there still is an argument that this party and that the Labour movement is too weak, in a sense, to develop on its own. And when the SDF disaffiliated in 1901. It did so explicitly on the issue of class war, which might seem a sort of slogan, as it were, but it was really trying to distinguish the Lib-Labism and, I suppose, the ethical socialism of the ILP. It was trying to say their version of Marxism, which focused on class and opposition to capitalism on class grounds, as opposed to a moral sort of ethical critique, that became something of a sticking point. Pardon me. The other I suppose limitation for the LRC in this period, and then the Labour Party subsequently, was the election of the 1906 Liberal government, and this was the Liberal landslide. Hello? Right, sorry. Am I still in connection?
Yes, you are.
Okay, fine.
We've done half an hour now, just to let you know.
Okay, all right. I'll just be winding up now. Yeah. So this was this failure, or these limitations, were because of the strength of the Liberal Party and its reform program. This, in many ways, is in many ways the establishment of the the type of welfareism that we will see later on in the 1945 government. Indeed, in terms of things like national insurance, old age pensions, and other areas, it really still is in many senses the sort of framework which shapes our welfare state. But I suppose more importantly from the union's point of view is that the Trades Disputes Act of 1906 and a number of other legal reforms strengthened the positions of the unions. And if you look on the website, you'll see the manifestos of the LRC and then subsequently the Labour Party. You'll see how in many ways they sort of follow in under the slipstream of the Liberal Party, and that they, in a way, orientate themselves towards the Liberal Party in its particular programme. Even those leaders of the Labour Party, such as Keir Hardie, who were explicitly socialist, were still, I think, quite conciliatory towards the Liberals, and still very uncertain about whether an explicitly socialist position should be adopted. But on the other side of the coin, not only do we have trade unionists such as David Shackleton, the MP for Clitheroe, who is really very close to the Liberals, people like George Barnes as well, and of course Ramsay MacDonald, we find, I think, that trade unionism and liberalism is still very strong. There are increasing criticisms of this approach coming from the left, often, fairly individualistic. Victor Grayson, famously, won a by-election in 1907 as an explicitly socialist candidate. He represents, I suppose, considerable left-wing opposition. And indeed, in the years running up to the First World War, there are also other forms of criticism as well on the position that the party takes towards women, the women's suffrage question, adult suffrage as well. And of course, something which I've left to one side, but I think is significant, disillusion, not only with liberalism and parliamentary politics, but indeed with many of the existing ideas of socialism, the growth of industrial syndicalism, and the idea of parliamentary and party politics, in a sense, not being a way forward. And the experience of the strike wave in the years 1910 to 14 tends to reinforce that. So some sort of questions that maybe we could discuss, or question in broader questions. What does socialism mean in this period? People talk about collective ownership, but there's also quite a lot of emphasis on ethical change, immediate reforms. And indeed, for many people like Ramsay MacDonald, socialism is a set of moral guidelines which really just emerge out of existing liberalism. And then I suppose the instruments of change, is this through working class self-emancipation, or is it through gradualism of the Fabian kind? And what's the role of Parliament in this? Is Parliament a platform or a way of mobilizing workers, or are we as socialists simply working to improve some immediate conditions? There's also the organizational nature of the Labour Party as a federation. You can't be an individual member of the party, you have to be a member of an affiliated group, whether a trade union or a socialist society. And will that group be the Labour Alliance, not the Left Labour Alliance, but the Labour Alliance, or will it be a specifically socialist party? The models of socialist parties on the continent are very different, and there is debate about whether British socialists should follow them. And I suppose, lastly, the relationship between external politics, particularly imperialism, and what's occurring inside the home country. And this, of course, is going to be significant, not only in the imperialist wars and the conduct of the empire, but of course the major imperialist war, which will break out in 1914. So those are some points, and I'll now throw it open to further questions and discussion. My apologies for slight overrun, only a slight.
No problem at all. Thank you very much, Kevin. That was excellent, very thought-provoking. Please, comrades, if you want to speak, ask a question or make a comment, please either raise your hand, not like that because I can't see you, but there's a little blue hand you can raise, and there's a few going up now, I can see. If you can stick to 3 minutes, that would be fantastic, so that Kevin can come back and reply to some of them. So Pat Byrne was first. Oh, sorry, I have to make some of you into panelists so that you can speak. Hold on, I should have done this before. Apologies. All right, I'm gonna have to make you into panelists, and please can you switch on your cameras so that we can see you. I'm gonna ask you, there he is, Pat. Okay, I'll bring you in first, Pat.
Okay, Tina, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah,
well, Kevin, that was a very interesting talk. I wanted to just raise some questions about it, because I think that I don't actually agree with the main thrust of the argument that you raised, because I think if you examine a lot of those points, original research in it, you find that a lot of these that have been put around and repeated in many books actually don't stand the test. So, for example, the aristocracy of labour. When you look at any of the aristocracy of labour, it doesn't stand up, that theory. Or those groups of workers were take the engineers, for example. The engineers were regarded to be the aristocrats of labour, the prime aristocrats of labour. But in fact, if you go into what happened, the struggles they were involved in, it's not a charity. It didn't give, even when they made profits from imperialism and so on, they didn't give those profits to the workers easily, believe me. They had the most vicious strikes, over and over strikes all over the country. And they had to fight for everything they got. And as a result, there was a massive class consciousness in that union. And that union was the first union to vote a communist as general secretary in 1897, and became the backbone of the communist movement, as did virtually all skilled workers, became the backbone of the communist movement. If you looked at, and I haven't got time to go into each section that was declared to be part of the aristocracy, they were the metal work, you know, still, they had terrible conditions, they had terrible health and safety problems, they had to work incredible hours, and you go into all of none of those people could really be described as aristocracy labour. And it was a shame that Marx and Engels took up this phrase, because it didn't actually explain anything. Now, the other thing is that what is not generally known is that in 1871, a Labour Party was set up 4 years later.
Yeah.
And that Labour
Sorry, Pat, you're really breaking up now.
Led by very quickly got 40 countries. But unfortunately,
Pat,
because of the breakup of the first. Okay.
It's really difficult. You're breaking up
Okay.
a little bit. Do you want to try come back a little later, perhaps, because we couldn't hear you there for.
No problem. Okay. All right. Okay.
Matthew Jones next.
Yeah. No, I just interested to see. I mean, you know, you talk about the development of the Labour Party in this country, and clearly, you know, it's completely different to the development of, say, as you say, the socialist parties in Europe, in which, you know, obviously, for a start, obviously the unions in Europe are directly built by the socialist parties, as opposed to here, where, you know, the unions arise and then you know, there is some integration of the left, but they're not specifically built as, you know, organs of, if you like, the SPD or the French Socialist Party or whatever else. I mean, what's interesting really is, you know, is really the run up to the First World War. You know, what's the sort of, you know, the participation in, say, that, you know, the congresses of the Second International, in which there's this huge discussion of this upcoming war, which they could see. And the likes of, you know, Rosa Luxemburg and so on and so forth, saying this is coming and we must oppose it and all the rest of it, and clearly predict the whole piece, you know, more in advance of everybody else, really. I mean, obviously the bits of the ruling class could see it, but when as a mass political phenomenon, the only people who are really discussing at any great level say, well, we're going to have this huge war and we're going to have to oppose the thing. And obviously, the collapse in 1914 is enormous. When you only have 2 members of the SPD faction in the parliament actually vote against the war, and then Jarre obviously is murdered in Paris, but virtually the entire Labour Party, apart from the ILP and a few other people, just collapse, into supporting the war, which is more or less, I suppose, their politics what you would expect. Heinemann and company. I mean, you could see it coming from 20 years previously, but it's then how does that relate in terms of the development of a left and Marxist politics in Europe in particular, to what's happening in Britain, and I mean clearly, some people are quite strongly integrated into the Socialist International, into the Second International, and go to all the congresses and so on and so forth. But it's how much effect that has in terms of the overall politics of the Labour Party.
Thank you, Jonathan Cooper.
Thank you very much, Comrade Kevin, for your very insightful knowledge of the period. How did all the various groups that made up what eventually became the Labour Party, that would be the ILP, the Fabians, the Social Democrats, and all the rest of them, how did they end up getting on the same page, so to speak? And can we learn from that period in order to rebuild the electoral and political coalition that has seemingly fallen apart now?
Thank you. Next comrade is Peter Kennedy.
Hi there. Right. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for that. Really enjoyable. Obviously, a lot of details about the emergence of Labour, the Labour Party, and I know now that we're at this moment. I know the talks go on to talk about the more modern, the transformations and the evolution of the Labour Party. But right now, you're talking about its pre-existence as a party, and so I wonder whether you could just pick up on something you mentioned earlier about the conditions of the time. You mentioned there's lots of things, lots of ingredients. Imperialism, the collectivization of labour, as you say, which I would say is socialization of labour. Socialization of capitalism, as you say at that time, which is part and parcel of imperialism, sort of form of imperialism. And obviously, the change in the way workers worked and the kind of industries that they set up and the way they worked, from craft to industrial workers, which probably was part of that groundswell of support for something different politically to represent them over and above the Liberal Party at the time. But the thing that interests me in all of that is how we galvanise this to make sense of it. And the way I tend to look at it, and I'm not going to go into it now, but the way I tend to look at it is the change in relationship between capitalism, socialism, communism. As part of this collectivization of capital, and we have in many ways, the colonization of socialism, and it's, which is then absorbed into this idea of the socialization of production, exchange, distribution. And I think the rise of the Labour Party and its pre-forms, the LRC and the Independent Labour Party and so forth that you've mentioned, speak to this kind of like sea change in politics. And it's no surprise really that the people who want to form the Labour Party have a kind of disdain for the working class too, because at the same time as they begin to form this Labour Party, there's also in society beginning to evolve, as I just mentioned, this idea of the necessity to collectivise production and exchange, and to give it maybe a new name. And one of the new names on the block is socialism. And as I come back before, it's kind of you know, for me, this gets usurped. Socialism gets usurped and torn away from communism. This turn away from communism becomes more complex with the rise of Stalinism, which is probably, you know, for a later time. Yeah. But nevertheless, I just think, you know, I want your opinion on whether you see the Labour Party as kind of trapped in this doomed kind of you know, destruction and corruption of socialism right at the heart of it. And so the seeds of its own destruction and the seeds of its betrayal of the working class lie there too. I won't say any more than that.
Thank you. I was going to ask something myself, actually. You were talking the background of the formation was quite different in Germany and the Labour Party in Britain. In Germany, the Social Democratic Party was set up much earlier than the Labour Party in Britain in 1875. It was made illegal straight away. It stayed illegal for 15 years. Probably that helped it to become quite radical. It came out of it with the Erfurt program, which was a very Marxist, openly Marxist program, which Engels was very happy about. Now in Germany, it was the other way around. It was and then out of this movement emerged the trade unions. Whereas in Britain, the trade unions helped to form the Labour Party. Do you think there's a reason then that the program of the Labour Party in Britain was never quite as radical as the program in Germany? Has it got to do with the unions? Has it got to do with other things? Where do you see the main differences? Because I think the Social Democratic Party served as a shining example to a lot of emerging Labour parties in that period. It was one of the first to get off the ground, etc. So how do you see the relationship between the two, and who influenced who more, etc.? And do you want any more questions, or do you want to answer a few now? Up to you.
I'll answer a few questions now so that I don't forget, and perhaps the people who ask them don't get fed up and clear off. Okay. First of all, Pat, who I think I remember from the Labour Student Organisation National Committee in about 1975. I think you're right, Pat, and as always happens in a talk like this, you have to really skate over the ground. One of the things that was in my own mind, and it actually links partly to what Tina's just asked, is that often in revolutionary movements, it's actually the skilled workers, both because they, you know, they have the time and often the position to organize, but there's also something else about their position in production, which is what I refer to as sort of self-confidence. You know, when we look at the revolutionary shop stewards in Germany, and we look at the revolutionary shop stewards in Britain in the First World War, these are skilled, quite well-paid workers. And they've got a sense of themselves, they've got a confidence, and I think that the term labour aristocracy is accurate. Not that they're, you know, living on the pig's back and that they have it easy, because capitalism never makes it easy for anybody. But their position and the things that they've gained through struggle, and also through their position in production, you know, I partly come, without getting too personal, I come from that sort of background of people who are electricians and engineers, and their attitude towards the ruling class is one of disdain, or was one of disdain, because they were the people who really ran the factories. They could run the factories without managers, and the same for other groups of skilled workers. So I think you're quite right about that, and I think you're right about the struggles. But their relative position in relation to other groups of workers, and I think the position of workers in the imperialist countries often relies upon the exploitation of you know, of the colonies. But you know, I wouldn't want to give the idea that, you know, these people have been completely bought off. But that idea of confidence and of revolutionary self-confidence is very striking, you know. And if we look at all sorts of movements, that's clearly there. Matthew's question on the relationship between the Second International and the Labour Party, and in particular the awareness of international developments. I think that I have done some, primary work. I've read quite a lot of Labour material, and one of the things that strikes me about it is that the many of both the local groupings or even the national groupings are often quite Anglo-centric. So, for example, they tend to talk about matters inside Britain or indeed the British Empire. Justice, the SDF's paper, does cover international events, but it's striking that often people, for whatever reason, where we can think of some maybe national reasons, but in Scotland and in Ireland, particularly in the SDF, they're influenced by De Leonism and the Socialist Labour Party in America. And I think often people like Connolly, later Larkin, and Maclean will often look to events that are going on, outside of Britain. I think as well that that people like MacDonald do have a type of British exceptionalism, and although MacDonald is a pacifist and he actually sticks to the standard Second International line, and he does actually move motions at the Second International that are opposed to war, in many ways he sees this as part of a sort of an ethical position. So I think the type of left position of Rosa Luxemburg, or indeed later on the position of Lenin on imperialist war, is one that wouldn't find sort of an instinctive home. Indeed, the ILP has a long tradition of pacifism, and although they're all dead now, but I would have known ILP members who were conscientious objectors in the Second World War, and that strand of non-conformist, religious non-conformism and pacifism was very strong with them. But I think that their weakness is that they see events in continental Europe as different. They might pass motions about Tsarism, they might sympathize with national liberation movements, but they do have what we might call a bit of podsnappery, about the glories of the British Constitution in that way. On John's point about groups being on the same page, well, actually they weren't often on the same page, and very reassuring, although also quite discouraging, given that we're talking about of 120 years ago, is that reading some of the reports of the conferences sounds very, very familiar. There are clear political differences, and the only thing that unites them is the idea of some form of labour representation. But as I said, the Fabians were fairly lukewarm on that, and indeed, bringing people together as you describe, it was often on a fairly lowest common denominator politics. And I suppose this is going to come up again and again, is the basis on which you might build a party, and what would bring us together. Do we just simply want working class representation? Do we want some form of socialist program? How is that going to be achieved? So issues of program, and I suppose quite what socialism is, were points of really quite strong disagreement. And Miliband points to this as being a recurrent issue. He doesn't see it, I think, in some sort of sense of an eternal struggle, almost like Manichaeans see the world in religious sense of a constant struggle between good and evil. But he does say that Labour's focus on parliamentary representation and getting a Labour government in particular, it just means that politics are about that. Rather like Herbert Morrison's comment that socialism is what a Labour government does, which you can take in all sorts of ways, but I take in particular to mean you get a Labour government, and that's socialism. And, you know, that may or may not be the case. Okay. Peter Kennedy, I think he made a very interesting point, and I think, yes, Fabianism does reflect this idea that capitalism was changing, and indeed there is a strand of thought. You'll see it later on, I think, with people like James Burnham, and you'll see it with others who argue that capitalism is evolving towards collectivism. And in the words of Lord Salisbury in the 19th century, we're all socialists now. So I think that the Fabians see Labour, just as they saw the Liberals before, as an instrument for, in almost a sort of an inevitable form of collectivization. And of course, monopoly capitalism is moving in that direction. The classic capitalism of the 19th century with the series of entrepreneurs and competition, that's being replaced. The growth of white collar financial capitalism, all of these things, I think, do tend towards that type of reformism, and simply seeing forms of collectivism inside a broadly liberal democratic framework as being the as being the goal. So I think that you could identify that with Fabianism, and I think you can also see it to a certain extent in what's going to come with the 45 Labour government that identifies socialism with forms of state ownership in that way. I think there's also the experience of the First World War. I know I'm jumping on quite a bit now, but the experience of the First World War, both in Germany and Britain, of state management of the economy, of a type of war socialism, reinforces again the idea that socialism is really just about state direction of the economy. And it's then a case of using the existing state as an instrument in that way. But I think it's an interesting question. And then lastly, Tina, you'll have to wait a bit later for that one. There are clear differences, and I think they are clearly about the economic and the social and the political development of Germany, the late arrival of a democratic state in Germany. The paradox is that the Kaiserreich has some greater degrees of democracy than lesser degrees. And I think that, and the nature of German industry and so on, all of these things are going to give a very different form, you know, to the two countries. It also links back to Pat's point of disagreement about whether imperialism has had an impact on the British working class and the British labour movement. And again, you know, the depth and the nature of that. So I think that it doesn't explain it, but it points to, you know, very different sets of experiences in that way. So that's my replies for the minute.
Thank you, Kevin. There have been a few written questions. I'm just going to read them out because some people don't want to appear on screen. John Bibi asks, and asked quite at the beginning from your first introduction, please tell me more about the social survey you mentioned. I hope you remember which one you meant. Was this influenced in any way by Siobhan Rowntree or Arthur Bowley? Mm. Then Tim Clapham is wondering about the role of Christians in the early party.
Tim Rowley?
Sorry, Tim Clapham.
Oh, sorry,
the role of Christians in the early party.
Yeah.
Marie Lydham says, can you say something on how the belief in socialism coexisted with loyalty to the fatherland, and who made the distinction in the running up to 1914? And then Antoinette is asking, are you planning a more in-depth examination of this period? Or maybe you've done it somewhere already. The people want more. Okay, I'm bringing in Alec now with their spoken question or comment.
Okay, hi. Yeah, thanks for your talk. It's been very, very interesting. The thing that I particularly picked up on was the forces that are needed to create a new party. and particularly we're talking about the amount of energy that it's going to take to set up such a party. And in particular, it's the type of energy really is class energy, working class energy. Because when you mentioned the Independent Labour Party, you mentioned that it was set up in Bradford around about the time of the Manningham Mill strike. When you talked about the Labour Party itself being set up, you talked about the match workers' strike at Bryant and Mays and the London Dockers. And that's the period that they kind of call like new unionism. It's, you know, this idea of a lot of the unskilled workers getting together and getting organised and having massive struggles, massive class struggles, and winning actually on quite a few at a time. So it seems it's that class energy that then provides the impetus to actually allow these kind of new parties to be established. In particular, the point I wanted to make about the new unionism was it was the fear, I think, of these new unions that got the more established unions who kind of ran the TUC to say, oh, yeah, probably we should now set up this Labour Representation Committee. But when you look at today and the Corbyn period that we've just been through, and we think about this idea of the class energy and industrial struggle, we had obviously did really well during the Corbyn period in terms of people joining, etc. But you looked at the number of strikes that were going on, it was very, very small. Obviously, notable exceptions from a lot of the professions, like the junior doctors and lecturers and whatever. But in general, it was quite a period of low industrial activity. So I think that was a real problem with the Corbyn project, because a lot of the trade unions then acted not always in the interests of their own members and ended up sometimes butting heads with CLP delegates, and we saw that over things like open selection at the Labour Party conference in 2018. And looking at it today, when we see the sort of the key workers being called heroes and whatever, a lot of respect being given to the key workers. At some point, we're going to come out of the COVID crisis, and these workers are going to be going for a pay rise, the same as they do every year. Do we think that there's a possibility now that this class energy might reappear on the industrial front, and that, as in the past, that's going to have some kind of reflection then through the Labour Party? So I guess it's, you know, looking at that experience of like the Match Girls and the Dockers and the Manningham Mills, is there something there that we can pick up for today? That's kind of the area that I'm Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. Before I bring in David, I'm going to start running a small poll that people could hopefully fill in to let us know if this session is working the way we've done it, or if we should make any changes. You can also send us any feedback to info@labourleft.org, because there's 6 more sessions. So if you think anything needs improving, etc., please send us this. Okay, there's David Reed coming in now. Right. Oh, no, what's happened there? Okay, you go first, Anthony.
History today, because capitalism is more threatened than ever before. It's in its death agony. And they've lost all these wars to recolonize Iraq, Afghanistan. They're losing the war in Libya. There's absolute chaos everywhere. Trotsky said the more they intervene, the more it disintegrates. It's a decaying system. They said that with the Second World War, it decay and degenerate, and there'll be revolutionary opportunities. But we have to understand the pressures of imperialism on the labour movement, as I was saying in my question, or in the written contribution. In the early days, you had a mass movement against the slave trade. A lot of the dockers were racist and came out against it. And then Lenin said the aristocracy of labour, the aristocracy of labour, the rest of the working class wouldn't be conservatised as the rest of the working class. and they're coming under assault now with the middle class, so they could change fundamentally and overthrow capitalism. But I do agree with the speaker. We've got to be dialectical about the aristocracy of Labour. Of course, they fight capitalism and they can be broken from imperialism, and they're good fighters. But yeah, but dual contradictory character, things change over, things turn into their opposite dialectically anyway. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Anthony. Aaron Howarth is next.
Right. I can unmute myself.
No, you're done. You're good.
Oh, I'm okay. Cool.
Yep.
My question was really just about the influence of obviously the socialists as opposed to the trade unions in the early Labour Party and the kind of the imbalance. So I was just reading through for example, the conference report of the 1900 conference, and out of the 129 delegates, you only had a handful from socialist, from the Fabians, from the SDF, and from the Independent Labour Party, as opposed to the trade unions. But then they held 5 out of the 12 seats on the executive committee and elected them. Obviously, when you compare that to later on in Labour history, where, you know, collectively the socialist societies only have, what, 1 seat on the NEC, maybe. I was just wondering whether their unusually high influence on the executive committee as opposed to the party conference and their numbers in terms of membership was to do with their organisational and intellectual kind of, as you said, heft, and whether this was recognised and this was the reason that they had such a, you know, a relatively large influence compared to their small membership at the time. Yes, that's just my question.
Thank you, Aaron. And we've got Pat Byrne back, and hopefully it's a bit more stable this time. Fire away.
Okay. Yeah, Tina, yeah? Okay. Yeah. Well, I wanted to respond in a way to what you asked the question, because I've got a bit of a controversial view, which is that I believe that the biggest difference between the British movement and the German movement, why the Marxists didn't dominate the movement, was actually to do with the leadership of the German Marxists, particularly Liebknecht and Bebel, who stood shoulders above their counterparts in Britain, and they were able to resist splits in the movement and build a movement. Sadly, in the British side of the pond, we ended up with a situation where the left tended to split on every occasion, and this happened with the Social Democratic Federation in 1884, and the Marxist faction walked out of the Social Democratic Federation. I think they made a big mistake, which they probably recognized later on. And it also happened between the split between the SDF and the ILP. It's very interesting that there was a referendum in 1897, and 75% of both the SDF and the ILP membership voted to merge the organizations. And this has been, by the way, this has been a campaign by Blatchford to get this to happen. And actually among the activists, Marxism was very popular in Britain. And it's very interesting that the first time, and sadly, Marx and Engels didn't form a political group in Britain. And so we don't really know what would have happened. But it's interesting that when the SDF, who were avowedly Marxist organization, the first picket line they attended was the cotton workers in Preston. And Hinman and Morris went up to the picket line, and they couldn't believe the response they had. The workers carried them shoulder high. And within about 9 months, there was a general, in the election, by-election to Parliament, Hinman almost got elected. Similarly, in 1891, was the first speech by a Trades Council representative on socialism at a strike meeting. And he got a massive support, massive response. But and when Blatchford published his book, Merry England, which was a generalized argument for socialism, he sold 1.5 million copies. That was about 1895. So there was a mass support potentially for a Marxist version of socialism. But sadly, the leadership of the Labour movement and of the left didn't match up to the leadership in Germany, who very carefully and wisely steered the ship of the party politics on the left in the direction they did, and were very successful.
Thank you, Pat. David, you were gone earlier. I hope it works now. Fire away.
Yes, good evening. Thanks for all of this. It's been very, very interesting. What I was going to ask was, what was the influence of the cooperative movement on the Labour Party, and that had obviously been going for some sort of 40 years or so by the turn of the last century, and therefore you would imagine that would have had an influence in, say, organising people, particularly sort of women, into politics, because they were were much more better represented in that than they were perhaps in the trade union and the socialist movements. Okay.
Thank you, David. Okay, just good timing. So Kevin, you've got 10-15 minutes to sum up.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll take them in order. I think it was John Bibby. The social survey, I think, appeared in a journal called The 19th Century. It was a questionnaire sent to all new Labour MPs who answered about books that had influenced them and ideas and so forth. It wasn't, I think, specifically connected to any of the social investigators that you referred to. So it's an interesting document. Tom Clapham, on the question of Christianity, I did sort of refer to that, and I think it is very important. I think that what we might loosely call non-conformity, was broadly influential, particularly in the ILP. But I think broader forms of radical Christianity were generally significant. I wouldn't play them down. I think my hostility to the sort of cliche about Methodism and Marxism is that it downplays Marxism, and I think Pat's mentioned some quite important points on that. I think I can never remember whether it's Lenin or Trotsky. I think it may well have been Trotsky who referred to a visit to a Labour church in London, and there were socialist Sunday schools. Indeed, I've interviewed people who attended them in the 1920s, and there was a lot of the form. Thank you, Pat. There was a lot of the form of religion in terms of songs and the sort of communal and collective life. So both as a set of sort of moral precepts, a type of secularized Christianity was quite important, but also Christianity in its real sense. So I think it is important, but it often was quite militantly expressed. Just because people were Christians doesn't mean that they were all meek and mild and turning the other cheek. They sometimes were often amongst the most militant group of workers. Mary, your question on the fatherland, I wasn't sure whether that was directed about the German SPD or the willingness of British socialists to support their ruling class in the First World War. I'll look at that a little more when we talk about the First World War next week. But I think you can see that for certain people that their support for imperialist war really flows from their idea of Britain and British capitalism being progressive. So in some senses, I don't see that as a great surprise. I think it sometimes comes as a surprise when the people that we might boo in terms of social democracy, such as MacDonald in Britain or Bernstein in Germany, find out that they were actually pacifists. And that just explains what one comrade referred to as a dialectical position. Alec, I thought your point about the energy and the nature of an historical movement as the basis for a new party is actually very interesting. And one of the things that occurs to me, because having been alive for a while, is that the type of contemporary left, and I think of the Corbyn left, and comparing that to the type of left that emerged in the 70s and 80s, was exactly that difference. Ralph Miliband himself, when he was a lecturer at Leeds University, used to address meetings of 200 to 300 talking about these topics in Leeds and other areas who were made up of young shop stewards, the sort of people who were emerging in the 70s. And when you look at that generation, they are the people who will, for example, become the militants in the miners' union, in the engineers' union, and elsewhere. And so if a movement's going to develop, I think it does have to have some sort of class energy behind it, or at the very least, a sort of sense of dynamism. And what I think was lacking, and with the Corbyn movement, were some of those types of connections. But it also relies, I think, to a certain extent on objective conditions. We might all will industrial militancy, and we might all see the connection between industrial militancy and socialist consciousness, but I think it's a little more complex than that. And so I think that will be a question that we'll need to return to, about the objective conditions for the development of a mass movement, and in particular, the nature of socialist consciousness. In a way, that lies there with Tina's question. It also lies there with Pat Burns' defense of German social democracy, and in particular, his importance, his focus on theoretical clarity, and about the role of a particular group of individuals. That isn't to say that Bebel and Liebknecht were perfect. I think Bebel did tend to compromise, and I think we shouldn't ignore some of the warts in the German social democracy, but it does talk about, it just show the relationship between the subjective and the objective, the objective character. And I think you're quite right about local struggles. I mean, I look particularly at the SDF in Burnley, and which is the area that Heinemann did very well in, and it's very clear there that there was a sort of a network of activists and militants, and there was a great support for forms of Marxism. I did make the point about the number of people who passed through Marxist organizations, and that again is our own experience. I mean, the ex-revolutionaries in this country probably now number about 250,000, and a number of people have been through the SWP, various groups in the Labour Party, and so on. So whether that's had a good effect on us or not, I'll leave for others to judge. Just a couple of small brief points. The co-op movement was important. It stayed out of the LRC, but again, by the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, it's a very large movement. Those of you that wander around old industrial towns, when we'll be able to go back out, you'll often see quite large co-op buildings. Sometimes they're the largest shops in the town. Just like the trade union buildings are actually bigger than the town hall in many of the old working class areas. So you can see that the money and the confidence, that sort of tangible sense of a movement, which is what the SPD did. So that, the British movement did have all of these things, but what it didn't have, I think, was a generalized idea of the transformation of society in that way. Aaron, you asked about the importance of the socialists in this movement, and I think one of the things that struck me was that trade union leaders were quite keen on using the sort of, I suppose, ideology and the enthusiasm of socialists. In some ways, they saw them as capable of inspiring, and indeed they saw them as representing something of the wave of the future. Also, many of their own members were socialists. So, for example, the SDF, even after it had formally withdrawn from the LRC, still had trade union members who attended as delegates. So the division between trade unionists and socialists, I think, is often overstated. But also, it won't be until the Labour Party develops as an individual membership organisation that the membership will grow, and those groupings will grow with them. So it's at an early stage of forming, and so consequently, I think it takes this particular form. I think that covers most of the questions. I'd like to thank everybody who contributed, and I've certainly learnt a lot from your comments, and I'll take some of them on board for the next session. As for Antoinette's point, I have written some localized articles on this, and I may put them together and maybe write the thing up that I've done now and see if we can publish it somewhere, or you know, even put it up on the website, and maybe get a bit of a debate going, you know, particularly on the various points about socialist consciousness and the differences between the different socialist movements, which I think are very interesting and very important.
There you go. That's a wonderful result, I think, of our first session, a book or a pamphlet. Excellent, or a website article. Well, we've had some very good news from the poll coming back. 98% thought it was useful, and just as many are thinking of coming to the next session. 30 minutes, 75% thought it was just right, but a staggering 19% thought it was too short. And I think that's actually, I could have listened longer to you, so it might be something to think about for the next.
Well, what I will tell you is that those 90% are all my relatives by blood and marriage.
They love seeing your face online, no doubt.
Any time they're going to see it.
So, comrades, if you have any questions or comments on this session, you can email us, info@labourleft.org. And please join the Labour Left Alliance on the same website. Please, you can sign our appeal. Please, if you can, make a donation to help us finance these webinars. They're not actually that cheap. And the background papers, which will be published on our website as well as the videos from these sessions. And hopefully we can get background papers up a bit earlier next time for the next session, and can publish all of that on our website as a sort of a useful page for education on the history of the Labour Party. I thought it was an excellent first session. Thank you very much for listening in, and thank you very much, Kevin, for delivering a very good first session. Thank you. See you next week.
Okay, thank you, Tina. Bye.
Bye.